Thank you. Good morning, my friends, and thank you for showing up for the commercial release of our book on Taiwan. This event this morning is sponsored by the Edward and Helen Hintz Book Project here at AEI, which celebrates works of important scholarship on national security issues. I'm Kori. I have the great pleasure of leading the Foreign and Defense Policy team here at the American Enterprise Institute, 3 stellar examples of which we are going to hear from this morning. AEI is an institution committed to defending human liberty, expanding economic opportunity, and making the world a freer and safer place. And we view our work on the defense of Taiwan in that context. The book we are releasing this morning, Defending Taiwan, came from the suggestion of AEI's president, Robert Dorr, who was listening to the arguments amongst the fellows of the Foreign and Defense Policy team and encouraged us to put them in print. And so which is the essays that resulted in this book. I edited it along with Allison Schwartz, who left us for the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where she's an Indo-PACOM analyst. And we are going to hear this morning from Dan Blumenthal, who runs the Coalition Project on the Defense of Taiwan here at AEI. His most recent book is The China Nightmare, which is an outstanding discussion of what the Chinese are saying and what we should be doing about it. He holds a law degree from Duke. He was on the US-China Economic and Security Commission for several years, including leading it. And we have the great good fortune to have him here. Next in our batting order is Mackenzie Eaglen, senior fellow here. And I have to say, I think there is no better defense budget and matching budget to strategy expert in the entire country than Mackenzie Eaglen. Her graduate work was at Georgetown. She has been an analyst in the Joint Staff, OSD, the House, the Senate, and it's our great good fortune to have her here. Her most recent report, 10 Ways the United States is Falling Behind China in National Security, is available on the AEI website. I neglected to mention Dan's Coalition Project's most recent report, China's 3 Roads to Controlling Taiwan. And batting cleanup for us is Michael Beckley, professor at Tufts University and also a senior fellow here at AEI. He did his graduate work at Columbia, where he also taught. And his most recent book is Danger Zone, written with Hal Brands, also on this subject of the defense of Taiwan. Okay, Dan, why don't you get us started, my friend? Talk about what you and Fred Kagan, who I should have mentioned, co-leads the Coalition Project. Tell us about how you're thinking about the defense of Taiwan.
Sure, absolutely. So I've been thinking about the defense of Taiwan since I was at the Office of Secretary of Defense in 2001, back when George W. Bush approved an arms sales package of $30 billion to Taiwan after the perception in the 1990s, this is now ancient history, was that Taiwan was starved of its defense needs. And it was just at the time that the United States was really looking for the first time at security cooperation with Taiwan and seeing how much Taiwan really needed to reform and change. And this is going back 22 years. How isolated it had become since the breaking off of diplomatic relations in 1979, not just from an arms sales perspective, but from a security cooperation perspective. Also, I just would emphasize, it's something people forget a lot, that was the first time that Taiwan was still going through a democratization period. It was the first time that civilians were actually required by law, by Taiwan's democratization law, to start filling defense positions. It was a huge time of change, and it's just, I think it's very important now to remember that Taiwan is still a very young democracy that had a certain history with its military, and civil military relations in Taiwan is still evolving, and that's why so many people who wish it well get sometimes, I think, overly frustrated with the pace of change there. But anyway, I come from the perspective that Taiwan and China, China has been coercing and pushing around Taiwan, however you want to start it, but at least since 1995, 1996, when Lee Teng-hui, the first democratically elected president of Taiwan, was first really kind of representing the Taiwan people and saying, changing the formulations across the strait to reflect the reality that there really were two different Chinas across the strait, and really updating, this problem, quote unquote, really began, as we have in our paper, when Taiwan, I mean, this may be historically one of the few cases where Taiwan country declares peace, essentially, and says we no longer have designs on the other, the Civil War is over, and the other country says this is a very hostile act. Your declaration of peace is a very hostile act. But starting to speak in terms of democratization and in terms of representing all of Taiwan's people, that's when China really started its campaign of coercion, 1995, 1996, with the missile tests around the Taiwan Strait to try to affect the elections. And my basic take is that what China is still doing is trying to affect the electoral politics of Taiwan. Now, it's as people have started to pay attention over the last few years, they've gotten more concerned about the possibility of, in my view, China escalating this ongoing, everyday campaign of coercion and cognitive warfare, and I'll get to cognitive warfare in a second, and going full out and conducting an invasion and occupation of Taiwan. But that would be an escalation of what it's doing on a daily basis. And again, the center of gravity there is to change, is to affect the polity in Taiwan such that they give up hope that there's any option but some sort of deal with China on its own terms. So the center of gravity of this dispute is the politics of Taiwan, and China knows that, and they're out affecting the politics of Taiwan every day. Now, it is absolutely true that Taiwan no longer would vote voluntarily for unification. That's absolutely the case. But what China is doing, and has done successfully actually in this election campaign, is change the terms of the debate to more favorable ground for China. So through the constant use of force, as we see just this weekend, the flooding of Taiwan, this feeling that you get on the island when you're there now that it's under siege, that the presence of the PLA is there at all times, plus its information campaigns, plus its disinformation campaigns, and so on. The debate that they're trying to create in Taiwan with some success is not about unification against independence. It's about saying that if you vote for the DPP party, you're voting for war. It's about war and peace. They've changed the terms of the debate. So it's one thing for the people of Taiwan to say we want independent. We do not want to voluntarily give up our independence. It's another thing if the Taiwan people believe that the United States cannot effectively come to their defense over time, and that the only other that there's a choice on the table between war and peace. And that's a situation that China's trying to affect on the island with some success. We saw recently, this past week, that China put out a plan about integration, a very specific plan about integration with Fujian and so forth. And people dismiss it as saying this is incoherent. On the one hand, they're exercising all around the Taiwan Strait. On the other hand, they're putting out a plan for peace and integration. It's not. It's all part of a comprehensive, coercive campaign. So with one hand, putting out plans about how to integrate, with another hand saying if you don't integrate, this is what you'll face, increasingly, war. And again, the people of Taiwan obviously are very resilient. They love their freedom, they love their democracy. But if they think over time that the United States isn't able to effectively come to their defense, not just defense in terms of a counter invasion, but defense in terms of stopping this escalating coercive campaign, then I think the terms change quite a bit. Let me just stop my the terms of the debate change quite a bit, and you have more Taiwanese giving up hope and so forth. So let me just say, the United States is now focused on a counter-invasion scenario, and that's understandable. And it's focused on a big war, and that's understandable. But we're in some danger here of an over-focus on that scenario, particularly given Chinese strategic thinking about how you could create cognitive effects through these kinetic operations. It's sort of like, there's two analogies I would give. One analogy is to the Cold War. Let's say during the period where we moved to a policy of massive retaliation in the Cold War, and we basically said we're prepared to defend Germany from an attack on the Soviets, and we're prepared to massively retaliate. Well, the Soviets said, okay, that's fine, so we're not going to attack. We're not going to attack Germany. We're just going to do 20 other things below the threshold of that, and we're going to affect the United States and its allies through coercion, subversion, and so forth. And so, the plan becomes too rigid, and that's, I think, where we're headed with Taiwan, which is we have a plan for counter-invasion. We may not be able to execute even that plan, but then China is able to do 20 things under that threshold that really affect the politics in Taiwan and maybe in Japan too. The other analogy I would have, which we talk about a lot in the Coalition of Defense program, is to the Israelis before the Yom Kippur War. They were so tied to this conception of how the Egyptians would attack. They were so convinced that if the Egyptians didn't have this weapon system and that weapon system, they weren't going to attack because the Egyptian goal was to take over the entirety of Sinai in their view. Now, that wasn't the Egyptian goal. They missed it altogether. The Egyptian goal was to take part of Sinai and then force an international pressure campaign to get the rest of Sinai. The United States is very attached to certain indicators and warnings in the Taiwan Strait, too attached. How many ships does China have? How many amphibs does it have? How many roll-on, roll-off ships does it have? Those things can be dulled, with the way the Chinese are interacting in the airspace around Taiwan and so forth. And we can be very surprised that the Chinese have a different strategy, again, to affect the underlying political dynamic in Taiwan such that Taiwan comes to the table. That they don't actually want to invade and occupy Taiwan, which is a very, very difficult thing to do, and would start World War III, and they have many more options under that threshold. So anyway, that's the basic argument, and happy to hear from my colleagues.
Thank you, Dan. I think that's really important, and I should point out that we snuck out an in-house copy of these essays last year, and as we were revising it based on what has changed in the course of the last year, we not only added Fred and Dan's essay, but we added a terrific essay by Blake Hertzinger, who was a visiting fellow with us and is now at the U.S. Studies Center in Australia, on the divergence between U.S. and Taiwanese planning for defense contingencies, which I really encourage you to read. Mackenzie, talk a little bit about your and John Ferrari's chapter about what the U.S. would be buying if we were serious about this, and what has changed over the course of the last year since you wrote it.
Those were really excellent points, Dan. You can't believe we have to remind people about certain facts. Young democracy, just peace is somehow hostile, but you constantly seems like you have to do that in Washington. I think the theme that I'm going to pick up on and answer your great question, Kori, is that the cheapest wars are the ones you don't have to fight. We know it, China knows it too. And so this constant use of what defense people, Pentagon people call gray zone operations, to continuously push the threshold of what's acceptable just short of war. So, it's not a hot, sharp, fast shooting war, but there may be some hard power capabilities or not, but they're constantly and slowly rewriting the rules in real time, which resets the baseline for what's acceptable and as normal. And then we all just go along with it. And over time, like a silkworm, slowly but surely, China's getting what it wants. And so I worry very much. I love your point about how wedded Washington is to the counter-invasion scenario. I worry about blockade and quarantine far more. I think Washington's ill-prepared for lawfare and quick-turn decision cycles. And if they really wanted to eat our lunch, they would do tricky things like that, where we don't have answers, we haven't war-gamed them endlessly, we haven't thought about it, how to be reactive within news cycle timelines. But even aside from the scenarios potentially around the security scenarios to defend Taiwan, I worry about that we're losing the competition. And that's what John and I think the theme of our chapter is that, again, back to cheapest wars are the ones you don't fight, so we need to win the competition by over-focusing on the war, which I get it. George Washington, the surest way to keep the peace is to be prepared for war. I fully support that. I'm all for peace through strength. But they're very, it's not that every capability, Kori, for the war fight is going to be effective for the competition. And that's where I think Pentagon leaders and Washington is getting it all wrong. That if we can win the war, then somehow everything will flow from there in the current, in the status quo, which is being, like I said, rewritten in real time in the region. And so we're losing the competition because we're not fully there. With a military that's been shrinking and aging for the past 4 administrations, just getting older and smaller every single year. Ships, planes, people, aircraft, size of the Army, just name it, name the issue. We have fewer and fewer of everyone, and that to compete effectively, primarily you have to be there, be forward, you have to be present. Presence missions range from the kinds Dan talked about. It's a spectrum of assurance, deterrence, persuasion, dissuasion, it's many different types of things. But to actually to perform that function, you have to be somewhere. And no matter how much Washington wants to spin certain capabilities or announcements of future capabilities not yet in hand, we cannot defy the laws of physics. One ship, one soldier, one plane can only be in one place at one time. When you have a much significantly smaller military that is less forward, you're not getting inside the head of Beijing's leadership and making them change their mind, because really that's what this is all about. It's one man. Can he change his mind? Can he wake up and say, today's not the day because America's doing X with its allies and partners and Taiwan is doing Y? And so I can get into specific capabilities, but I want to kind of set the scene here that we're losing the competition, which is probably going to invite the war we want to avoid.
Mm-hmm. Mackenzie, can I ask you, since you are on the Commission on the Future of the Navy, to say a little bit more about the comparative shipbuilding capabilities of the U.S. and Chinese Navy?
Sure. I mean, when we think about maritime forces and sort of a net assessment of those forces, it's important to think about fleet size and strength. And Washington will tell you when it comes to strength, basically lethality, so it's not just about tonnage and numbers of hulls, but it's about, what fires off of those ships, what flies off of them, what capabilities are carried on them. Washington's very confident in our strength. I'm less so. I think I see both as in net decline, just strength less slowly than size. Basically, China's shipbuilding capacity, I think last week the intelligence community or maybe it was actually China, I can't remember who, is 200 times of America's. Their ability to produce ships. It can be everything from frigates to destroyers to things that we don't even have. Not to mention that the People's Liberation Army Navy is only one part of their maritime forces. They also have many other gray-hulled ships which aren't classified as military, but which could be used in any security scenario. They're like Coast Guard and other types of ships. They're maritime militia, et cetera. They can crank out, Kori, in a month what America hopes to do in over a year in terms of shipbuilding. And it's worse and getting worse it's not just bad, it gets worse each year. We cannot seem to catch up. And part of the reason here is the Navy budgets continue to ask for, like, for example, this year, 8 new construction ships, not 9 as the administration has said, but retire 11. And you see that consistently across, again, administrations, the last one, the one before it, the one before that. Until we can significantly crank up our own production capability, as well as fix our maintenance challenges and the longevity of which time it takes to repair ships, that gap's only going to get worse.
Thank you. Michael Beckley, your chapter for this book talks about the near-term threats to Taiwan. Talk us through how you're thinking about that problem, especially whether your judgments have changed in the course of the last year.
Well, one of my chapters that I co-authored focuses on the threat of an invasion, so I'll be the one to talk about why I think it actually is a severe threat. I mean, my colleagues are right that we don't really know how China is going to approach Taiwan. There's multiple different strategies they could use. This is just the defender's dilemma. The offense gets to choose how the war is going to start. But the advantage for the defender is that it's a lot harder to control a situation, especially a slippery political situation like elections in Taiwan, than it is to disrupt the plans of attackers. And to me, it just seems like, yes, China will continue its political coercion. Maybe China will opt for a blockade, but many of these strategies, I'm not so sure will work. I can't think of a blockade in history that convinced a nation to give up its sovereignty. Political coercion so far, the CCP seems to just make more enemies than friends everywhere it goes. They alienated Sweden. I mean, who loses Sweden, let alone like half of the Taiwanese electorate? And so what my concern is not because I discount any of these threats. They're all very real. And I also agree there was probably an over-focus on the D-Day style invasion. But I also think there's a reason for that, which is that this would be the true decisive outcome, a massive military attack. Whether it's followed up by an invasion or not, it could just be a massive barrage that destroys pretty much all of Taiwan's offensive capabilities. All those shiny new F-16s burning on the runways, the few capital ships you have are sunk, and that's all being shown on TV. And I just worry that unless there's a crack effort to diversify away from those big bases, exposed platforms, that the CCP might think, hey, if we just give Taiwan a massive bloody nose and pummel them, their morale will collapse. They're not fighters, they're not Ukrainians, and that could be the start of a massive war. And so I don't discount the likelihood of those other scenarios, but it's the impact of an invasion or some kind of surprise air and missile barrage that really keeps me up at night, because that's how we get to World War III. In terms of the time frame, again, I worry because you have this election coming up. I think the CCP is going to do all this political coercion, and time is not on China's side from a political perspective. The Taiwanese seem to be drifting further and further away. Even if the KMT wins this election, I don't see that much difference. I mean, Hoyoe I assume is not going to say, hey, let's take a referendum on unification, or let's open up. There'll be talks. But if anything, if that convinces the CCP that, hey, maybe we have more time on the political situation, and that buys Taiwan time to further build up its military, then to me, that's all to the good. And so I don't see a straight line from you have a political warfare campaign to Taiwanese capitulation. I don't see that in the cards. Maybe I'll be proved horribly wrong after this election. And so my worry is that almost the opposite. You're going to have the failure of a CCP political warfare attempt, which then they'll have to start thinking about non-peaceful methods like flexing their military muscles. Now, whether they try a blockade or an offshore island seizure, I don't know. But to me, it seems like that is coming sooner precisely because there is this decisive turning point where the Taiwanese people are going to vote. There's going to be some kind of back and forth between the Taiwanese government and the CCP, and it's hard for me to see the CCP getting satisfaction from really any outcome that emerges from that, at which point, they're looking at the military situation, which I agree for the United States and Taiwan is very dire right now. But I think by the 2030s, hopefully, with Mackenzie and Dan's help and people sounding the alarm, maybe things will be turned around. And I just worry that the chapter with Hal Brands that I wrote looks at history and all these cases of when these great powers lashed out and tried to accomplish these long-standing national aims. And it wasn't when they felt super confident. It also wasn't when they were in free fall and declining. It was in this middle stage where they had built up formidable capabilities but felt like the political situation was turning against them, and so they needed to use their sizable military advantage while they still could before the other side encircles and crushes them. So on that happy note, I realize all the titles of all the way, it's like The China Nightmare, Terrible 20s, Dangers, and we need like a Happy Days book or something to come out of AEI, but that's unfortunately not going to be from me.
So I would add to your list of aspiring powers that view the window of their potential ambitions for closing. I would add to that list, that's a plausible explanation for why Russia pulled the trigger and invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. Right? Like they saw Ukraine becoming more and more Western and becoming more and more committed to democratization, anti-corruption, and freedom. And I worry that we have a set of lessons we think the Chinese should be taking from the experience of Russia in Taiwan, the willingness of the West to band together and support a fledgling country trying to preserve its sovereignty, the economic power of the West in sanctions and in production of weapons to provide and budgetary assistance to provide Ukraine. There are a series of lessons. I worry those aren't the lessons China's taking. Dan, I'd love to know your thoughts on what you think the Chinese Communist Party might be taking away from the war in Ukraine.
Well, so it's learning to be careful about if it could take back some of the statements it made. It thought Putin was going to win. It thought Putin was going to win decisively, and he's obviously disappointed them quite a bit. In terms of lessons, well, there's one big one, right? And this speaks to any scenario you're talking about. So one is the Chinese are racing to parity in nuclear weapons, nuclear coercion. So Chinese grand strategy, and again, let me just sort of, Chinese grand strategy is comprehensive coercion. That is their grand strategy. So it's not a question of when they start using force against Taiwan or South China Sea. By the way, there could be wars with China in a lot of different places, including Korea, South China Sea, and Taiwan. Taiwan is just our obsession at the moment, but there can be wars. Nuclear coercion, because China's grand strategy is comprehensive coercion, subversion, co-option. That's their grand strategy. That's how they use force. I teach a course on how China uses force. They use force in the context of comprehensive coercion. Nuclear coercion, the ability to shape the United States political decision making through the threat of escalation is lesson number one. So now you take the scenario. So China is using force every day in the Taiwan Strait. They have a lot of time. They have, they're right there. They can do this for 20, 30 years. They do not feel like they're running out of time. They feel like time is on their side. In 10 years, they'll have, as Mackenzie points out, more ships, more aircraft, more missiles, and they'll have possibly escalation dominance. So then you go back to the Taiwan people in 10 years, and sure, the KMT and the DPP could say whatever they want to say in the next 10 years about unification. But then all of a sudden, this anti-access area denial strategy that they have now has nuclear weapons, theater nuclear weapons. You say, okay, the Chinese then go to Taiwan and say, okay, you didn't like this integration plan we put out in 2024. What about this integration plan? Oh, you don't like that plan? Who's going to come, give me your second best alternative. What is that? War with us? The United States going to come to your defense? That's how they play. I mean, that's how they succeeded in the South China Sea. They succeeded in, to some extent, the East China Sea. That's how they do things. That's their modus operandi. So number one lesson is get escalation dominance and create even more of a sense of seizure around Taiwan such that you're constantly cutting off Taiwan's political options. You're constantly going back to Taiwan. You didn't like plan A? Here, try plan B. Let's negotiate. Don't want to negotiate? Okay, well, how about a bloody nose? Then we can come back home for a while. This is what they did in Vietnam in '79, by the way. In Vietnam in '79, they absolutely knew they were going to lose on the battlefield. They didn't care. They won because they broke the alliance with the Soviets. So they announced that they're going to go into Vietnam 40 miles and come back, and not even fight the Vietnamese, the best Vietnamese forces. The point was to show everyone that the Soviets couldn't defend Vietnam and break that alliance. That's how they fight wars. They fight wars very differently than we fight wars.
Michael, other lessons you fear the Chinese might be taking away from the war of Ukraine attempting to defend itself?
Well, I think besides just the go big and brutal from the start, don't stumble into your target on 4 different axes and allow the outside world to resupply it indefinitely. I also, just to take up Dan's point, I worry a lot about the Philippines because you're opening up new bases in the Philippines. This is the country that took China to the World Court and won, about nullifying China's South China Sea claims, at least in the eyes of international law. And you have this new administration, well, the new old, I guess, back in power. And so I just worry China has a history of, killing the chicken to scare the monkeys, so to speak. Making a bloody example of some relatively weak power in order to shatter an alliance with some greater power to scare off others when China feels encircled and vulnerable. It, historically anyway, has gotten violent. The Vietnam scenario, I would put the war with India also comes out of this fear of being encircled by all these different powers, so you got to make a lesson out of at least one of them. And the Philippines basically doesn't have a military, and we have said that their ships are covered under our alliance with them. So, what better way than to shatter the credibility of the United States at minimal military cost and to make an example out of this outspoken upstart that's trying to open up new bases for the American military. I've been in a number of war games, and there's just no easy answer to this scenario. So as much as we talk about Taiwan, I agree with my colleagues that we need to be also thinking about some of these other scenarios because China may itself be saying, you know what, there's this low-hanging fruit there. We don't know if we're ready for the full Monty yet. We don't want to end up like Putin. This would be a massive gamble of the entire CCP to invade Taiwan or blockade it or anything like that. But an operation over the Philippines, that could just be the appetizer. So.
Mackenzie, from an American perspective, what should we be doing militarily to foreclose that? The administration's done a lot of very good work, I think, with American friends and allies in the Pacific. But Michael and Dan point out that China may be tempted to test the strength of those commitments. And I noticed that President Biden has 4 times blithely said the United States would send troops to defend Taiwan, although we were unwilling to do that for Ukraine. Are you worried that there's a gap between our stated policy over Taiwan and what we're willing or able to do?
I'm tempted to drive the wrong way in one-way traffic after this panel because of the excellent points that you have raised. Now have me even more worried. So you'll recall, Kori, our event with Eli Ratner, the Pentagon's chief China guy, here at AEI. He had made a big, bold announcement when he said, in the next year, this is about just over a year ago, and he said, in the next year, you're going to see, more announcements than have had in a generation about posture changes, and I think he followed through on that. I think the team over there has done a great job with new agreements, new basing rights access, new security arrangements, the promise of new future facilities and infrastructure for the U.S. military to use, because since we play an away game, we can't do anything for longer than a few days without a whole lot of help in the region. So when it comes to posture, I see a good news story. So finally have something good to say. When I see progress, I see a team in a hurry. So I'm going to give them a lot of credit there. But when it comes to, and I even see some other ways that you could give Defense Department leadership some credit, but I'm going to focus, of course, on where I think they could do better, which is this complementary spectrum of capability and capacity. And of course, capacity is your size and relative readiness and lethality and modernization of your military forces. And conventionally speaking, although I think we're at a nadir conventionally and strategically with our nuclear forces as well. I know the Triad's modernization is underway, but it's not. I see a lot of bumps in the road with it staying on schedule, with pit production, with many other different things. So conventionally, I'm worried about that. It's pretty clear that we are less forward, fewer assets, fewer ways to project power, fewer numbers of times with fewer people. And I think that's pretty clear, as I mentioned earlier, on just sort of not being forward as often as we used to, partly because we lack sufficient size. We also we're a global power. We just sent a whole bunch of troops and forces to the Middle East because Iran's acting up right now and threatening shipping and trading and other, the security stability in the Middle East, which is a huge problem for our economy. So we care obviously deeply about that. It's increasingly zero-sum, Kori, when we have to send forces over here to deal with a problem, we're taking them from somewhere else. It's not as if we have this vast reservoir back here in the U.S. of capacity. And so that's the biggest gap that I see, that if anyone wants to call our bluff, they'll pretty soon see it for themselves.
Mm-hmm. So, Michael, you've done a lot of outstanding work about the Chinese economy relative to the American economy and about what constitutes power. Can you talk a little bit about China's future and the extent to which we have a long-term versus a near-term challenge with respect to China?
Yeah, I think we're in a great place to talk about that, because I think AEI has been, if you look at Derek Scissors, Dan's work, a whole bunch of other, Nick Eberstadt, these were China bears before it was cool, before the last 3 months or whatever. These things are all structural, I think, is the main point, that this is not some new crisis set off by a real estate collapse or anything like that. This is a fundamental structural problem in China's economic growth model, which is that it just relies on force-feeding credit through the system, endless infrastructure spending, and especially now that you have a shrinking population, you just don't need all of those housing projects and roads and bridges, and so you have a lot of wasted assets, and you've racked up a lot of debt. And so at this point, I think comparisons with Japan, in the 1980s, 1990s are instructive, not because China is Japan, because it's actually worse in so many ways, and we've seen the lost decades of essentially zero growth that Japan has suffered. So you have the massive debt overhang, the just pure lack of productivity in the economy. Productivity, making more output for every unit of input, that's been negative for more than a decade in China. So spending more and more to produce less and less. That's kind of similar to what Japan had, but unlike Japan, China on a per capita basis is about a third as rich as Japan was in 1990 when its asset bubble popped. Japan's population was still growing at that time. It actually didn't start shrinking until 2008. China's population is shrinking extremely rapidly. It's about to collapse. The latest estimates suggest the Chinese population is going to collapse in half sometime between 2060 and 2100. It's definitely going to happen this century. It's just a question of whether it's going to happen in 40 years or in 70 years. And more importantly, the aging. By 2030, China's going to lose an entire France of working age adults and gain an entire Japan of elderly retirees. We've never seen this kind of contraction in the population, which means you're not going to get the big surge in consumption-fueled growth that international analysts are always haranguing the CCP to implement, as if and meanwhile, Xi Jinping shows no interest in that. He calls that welfarism. He doesn't want to build he wants to give more money to the hard assets, which means essentially doubling down on the existing model, which is well past its sell-by date. So I don't see I think the scenarios are Japan-style slowdown and lost decade, or some people think there could be some kind of crisis within China. I don't think that, just because the biggest borrowers and the biggest lenders are all controlled by the state, but it's not out of the question. But this idea that somehow China is going to revive growth through some kind of Hail Mary pass, that Xi Jinping is going to brilliantly think of some new scheme, or that AI is going to somehow compensate for the massive shrinkage of the population, I think is just, it's not in the cards. It would have to defy the laws of economic physics. And so that means we're going to be dealing with a China that, in some ways, it's a more explosive threat than the one that we've been talking about for the last 35 years. We're used to talking about a confident, rising China, but now we're one that's in the longest, most protracted economic slowdown of the post-Mao era. In the back of the day, if the CCP could count on a booming economy and rising legitimacy and prosperity, it could afford to maybe give in a little in crises or shelve certain disputes. But now that you don't have that economic crutch, what does that leave the CCP? Virulent nationalism, territorial aggrandizement, and a big push to try to revive its fortunes by essentially carving out an economic empire through something like Belt and Road, and massively pumping in money to these supposedly game-changing technologies. I mean, these are the kind of Hail Mary passes they're going to be going for. And I just worry that in the short term, that's going to actually accentuate tensions, if not outright conflict, between the United States and China.
Yeah, and we see that phenomenon in the aggressiveness of, for example, Chinese information operations against Japan for releasing IAEA-approved water from the Fukushima nuclear plant. And you can see the rising Chinese aggressiveness and the fueling of nationalist responses to things increasingly in the last couple of years.
They just circulated a video among the CCP about nuking Japan. They said they would make an exception for the Japanese if they intervene in a war over Taiwan, to nuke them a second time is basically what they said. So this is the kind of rhetoric that's being bandied about in the CCP right now.
Dan.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote The China Nightmare, The Grand Ambitions of a Decaying State. I'm with Michael on a lot of the problems and so forth. Derek Citizen and I wrote a paper in 2016 called China's Great Stagnation. But we have to remember that it still is the second largest economy in the world. If it slows its growth, it's still going to grow faster than Japan and other countries. They're still very confident. They're still very confident that if you look at the 20th Party Congress speeches and the 19th Party Congress speeches, they're very confident that this is a new era, very ideological, very confident that it's actually the capitalists that are in decline. They write and talk about how they predicted these problems. These problems were predictable, and that the West is starting to contain them, but it's a bump in the road. It's an obstacle on the pathway to the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. To the extent that they've acted against other countries in the South China Sea when they were confident. They've acted against Taiwan and Japan when they were not so confident. The tendency to kind of conflate, I think, China's domestic problems with foreign policy aggression, I'm a little skeptical of. There's two different logics at work there. That's been the case since Mao's days. There's one great example in Chinese history of China pulling off diplomatic coup after diplomatic coup when it was facing much worse problems, and that's from 1969 to 1979. So 1969, Mao's Cultural Revolution had absolutely ravaged China. The Soviets were ready to strike China's nuclear weapons. They had bad relations with the United States. They were having bad relations with Vietnam. 10 years later, with still a very weak economy and ravaged by the Cultural Revolution, they had renegotiated the geopolitics of the world and had a relationship with the United States against the Soviets, had done what they wanted against Vietnam during a war. I think that there's a lot of, while people are unhappy with Xi Jinping right now in China, while they're unhappy with COVID restrictions and the way he handled it, there is just a lot of resilience in that system, surprising amounts of resilience in that system.
An important counterbalancing point. Let me ask one last question before we go to the audience, and that is, what do you think what have you seen Taiwan do differently in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine? Has it affected Taiwan's politics, military thinking? Dan, Michael, either of you care to take this?
I can go first then. I mean, so President Tsai Ing-wen is seized with the Ukraine issue. Her closest advisors, their task forces and studies and of everything from UAV, counter UAV capabilities. It's very difficult in Taiwan, and I want to stress this. President Tsai announced longer conscription periods and a reserve force and so forth. The politics of this are very, very difficult in Taiwan because if you're the DPP and you do things that seem to be more forward-leaning on defense, you get criticized by the KMT and the opposition parties as well as by the CCP for being too warlike. Again, the political. So the short answer to your question is there are certainly attempts to do more. The United States is doing a lot more with Taiwan than we used to be doing. The politics of defense, and because of the legacies of one-party rule and the abuses of the past abuses of the Taiwan military and so on that go back 30 years, there's still, while the military is fundamentally changing in Taiwan, those relations are still very difficult. They're not doing as much as some of the civilian leadership would like.
Michael, anything to add?
I think that there's been great changes on paper. Whether it actually will translate into assets on the ground, I think remains to be seen. You've had, a 15% increase in the defense budget, but that takes it to, I think, $19 billion or something like that. I mean, it's not gonna, I don't know if that's gonna really get the job done. And the conscription, we'll see if that really leads to a credible reserve force, but I worry that it's basically, you're taking the 4-month summer camp that it currently is and turning it into a year-long summer camp where you might shoot your gun, 3 times instead of 2 times or something. I mean, unless there are fundamental changes and you're heavily arming these reservists with heavy weapons, which they are currently not being armed with. These are small armed equipped reserve units. I don't think it really makes much of a difference. And if you don't secure the command and control system, I'm worried you're not even gonna be able to call them up, because the Chinese, they're not gonna do what the Russians did. They're not gonna stumble in. If they go for Taiwan, I think they're gonna go really hard. They're gonna take down all those communication systems. And so how are you even gonna call up 1 million reservists who are all sitting at home with their moms or whatever? I mean, there's just no way that you're gonna get them onto the beaches in time for if it's truly the dire scenario. And this is the fundamental problem, is I think most people have trouble coming to grips with the idea of the best way to preserve peace is to prepare for war. And I understand that. That makes total sense. But the problem is, in a democracy, that gets spread across the entire population. And so politicians just don't have an incentive to say, hey, my plan for the nation is for us to get into a defensive crouch and get pummeled by the Chinese for weeks on end and pray for American intervention, and then everyone's gonna get an RPG and we're gonna go out there and take on the People's Liberation Army. That's just a hard message for any politician to sell, and that's why you have this problem in the civil-military relations in Taiwan as well that prevents translating these. I think the defense minds have the right ideas. They're saying all the right things, but it's just very hard to mobilize that. And I would say the same thing in the United States too, for all the reasons that Mackenzie and Dan have articulated in their research.
And I would point out that the Financial Times' Dimitri Savastopoulou is going to host an event here on October 3rd, I think it is, with Zach Cooper and some others, talking about Taiwan and looking at the question of Taiwanese willingness to defend itself. Okay, questions from the room. All the way in the back.
Hi, Charles Hutzler with the Wall Street Journal. On that point about Taiwan politics, Taiwan is entering its political season, and the outcome is uncertain. But so how dependent should U.S. planning around Taiwan be on the Taiwan political situation? What if we get a change in government? Does the U.S. have different strategic interests around Taiwan than perhaps a Taiwan government or the Taiwan people might have?
Dan, I feel like that's your wheelhouse.
does the U.S. have a different? No, they don't have a different. They don't have a different focus. I don't think the planning changes. I think that the U.S. and Taiwan, there are two basic things that the U.S. and Taiwan have to do together. So, the other thing that happened after the Russian invasion of Ukraine is that China has ramped up its coercive and gray zone threats around Taiwan, and Taiwan has to answer that. So when I say the campaign is already on, the Chinese coercive campaign is already on, they have a strategy of wearing out Taiwan pilots, as President Tsai says, they have a strategy of making what they call the cognitive domain, the domain of how you respond, how you make decisions, much more saturated, much more difficult than it used to be. And Taiwan has to respond as a democracy. Those in the U.S. telling them that they should just ignore those threats, are not running a country. They're running. They're in a think tank somewhere. They're not running a country that actually has to respond to people's fears, and that's going to continue this ramped up campaign. And that's part of the reason why Taiwan has this difficult balance where it's the one pushing back against this overfocus on counter-invasion and reserves going to the beaches and so forth. Because every day when they get up in the morning, the Taiwan government has to face this onslaught of an air incursion, of a drone incursion, of an information incursion, of maritime erosion of sovereignty and so forth. And the U.S. and Taiwan have to continue to plan to stop that. And if we don't continue to plan to stop that, then the counter-invasion scenario doesn't matter.
And if I could add, I think it's difficult for the United States to really appreciate the sense of potential hopelessness of small countries facing threats from larger aggression. And to the extent there are differences in planning, it's actually really important for the United States to be strong, forward present, and engaged in a way that encourages small countries to believe they can defend themselves against larger aggressors. So what we do really matters, and I don't think we should be worried if the U.S. is more forward-leaning than a democratic government in Taiwan needs to be, because our choices will have an enormous effect on a small country's belief that it can resist aggression.
That's excellent point. And I'm sorry to take, but Taiwan cannot defend against China without the United States. It's just not possible. And so it's just so important that the U.S. start to do more and keep doing more to train, exercise, equip, undermine the constant sort of harassment they face.
So we have a question from Douglas Carr online. Is Taiwan's political opposition committed to the defense buildup and the hedgehog strategy of Taiwan? Michael, would you like to take a swing at that?
I think maybe initially, not so much. I know there's a foreign affairs piece this morning, which I haven't had time to read from the leading candidate, so maybe consult that. My sense is they want to at least make a good faith effort to try to tone down the level of hostility. But again, going back to some of the earlier points, I just think that's going to fail very quickly. I think the CCP won't give in, is not going to let up on this coercion campaign, and so we're going to be right back where we started. So I guess what I'm saying is you can count on China to reinvigorate at least talk about reforming Taiwan's defense. But under any regime, I'm worried that the resources and the actual assets on the ground won't be forthcoming regardless.
Mm-hmm. Next question here in front.
Good morning. George Nicholson, the Washington liaison for the Global Special Operations Forces Foundation. Something you didn't really touch on is resolve and perception. And I go back to my close friend who was the ambassador to Saudi Arabia, and he says the question every time he meets with him is, can we depend upon you in the future? We look at what you did to the Shah of Iran, almost forcing him out and not supporting him. We look at what you did to Anwar Sadat about when he was having problems, we didn't back him up. looking at how we pulled the plug on the Vietnamese, pulled out and left them in the lurch. Look what we've done to Afghanistan. And increasingly, we're seeing within this country dialogues about, is our support in Ukraine really in the national interest? Should we really be doing that? And I'm sure that the Chinese are looking at that, but even more important, our allies around the world looking at that. Should we be sticking out our neck? We already see what's happening with the Saudis.
Right, so maybe I'll take that one.
I was going to say,
And I think countries that rely on Americans' security, provision of security, either treaty allies or countries to whom we have made commitments and have friendly relations, they're right to always worry about that, because there is no substitute for winning the political argument in the United States on that issue. And I take your point that, the abandonment of Iraq, the abandonment of Afghanistan, and our domestic politics in the United States being particularly febrile at the moment, make allies nervous. But that's a fundamental condition of reliance on another country for commitments to your security. So they're right to be worried. They're right to always be worried. And yet, I think what you can see in polling of American attitudes about China is an overwhelming and increasing concern by my mother and other normal Americans that China is a predator and that free societies have a right to have our help to defend them in the face of that Chinese aggression. That doesn't mean we've won the argument. The president should, especially if the president's going to commit American troops to the defense of Taiwan, which he has 4 times in public, he ought to be spending a lot more time talking to the American people about what that means from us. So I see 2 more questions in the room, and I want to take them both together, and then we will answer. One here and one here. Go.
Thank you. Chase Stewart, Strategic Technologies. In what ways does Taiwan's claim to the 9 or 11 dash line impact its regional, bilateral, multilateral relationships? And then how does PRC national sentiment affect the decision to invade or not?
Okay, those are both great questions. And the last one over here.
Thanks for a great panel. I'm Mike Fonte. I work for the DPP here in Washington. 2 things. First, I'd suggest that you look at the National Defense Report, which was just released from Taiwan. Has some section in there about how to deal with the conscription for a year, how to train people. A lot of good words on paper. Implementing that's going to be the big issue. Second thing I'd ask Mackenzie about, to expand a little bit on what I call the lattice work of deterrence that the U.S. is trying to build, whether it's the Quad, AUKUS, works with the EU, some of the joint military exercises. Seems to me there's a growing strength in that development. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Great. Let's wrap any closing comments in as we go. We have 3 minutes left. So Michael Beckley, why don't you start? We'll go straight down the line.
Okay, I guess I'll try to take on the nationalism issue. I mean, I think it's not the diversionary war kind of thing where, Xi Jinping says, oh, I need to create a war over Taiwan to rally nationalism and then restore my legitimacy. But I think it's a longer term process of, if you don't have other means to shore up your legitimacy, you start playing on anti-xenophobic sentiment, nationalism. I think we already see that in CCP propaganda, and that fundamentally shapes the interests of the country itself. It changes the objectives and the amount of risk-taking that you'd be willing to do there. And so it's not so much a let's divert the public and distract them with a war, it's let's mobilize the public for national sacrifice, to eat bitterness and for international glory and to make China whole again. And that is just a China that is more primed to take big risks over something like Taiwan. So.
Excellent point. Mackenzie.
I like your term, the lattice work of deterrence. I want a blanket. Mm-hmm. It's just, that's not good enough because you can poke holes and see right through lattice. But I'm not, however, AUKUS, great. All the other agreements and arrangements that you specified, also important. But I would say that they were all in reaction to Chinese aggression. So they came about because those countries were the victims of Beijing's bad behavior. Glad we're doing it, but these are all things that take 10 to 20 years to come to fruition. And so that really concerns me. I want to know what we can do today and tomorrow and next week and next month better to bolster deterrence and do the 10-year arrangements like AUKUS.
Excellent. Dan, you get the last word.
The last word, okay, two points. One is, so the nationalism, I agree completely with Michael. The CCP and Xi Jinping wants badly to embarrass and humiliate the United States. Badly. And this, this is like, it's all out there. It's all written about. It's all speechified. He wants to give the United States a bloody nose. He believes we're in terminal decline, and I can't stress this enough, that implacable hostility to the United States that is responsible for all his woes in his view. Taiwan is secondary to that. Taiwan could be one place where he decides to do that, but I just absolutely need to emphasize that. Implacable hostility wants to embarrass the United States. The second point I agree completely with Mackenzie that it's a lattice work. It's not firm enough. That the Chinese need to know. They need to know, that if they attack Taiwan, if they attack the Philippines, if they attack Japan, that a global coalition is going to act. A global coalition. We have a fleeting opportunity because of what we've done in Europe with the Ukraine. A very fleeting opportunity. The debate should not be about whether or not we aid Ukraine. The debate should be about how we leverage the fact that we did and will aid Ukraine into a global coalition that counters China and is much more firm about the use of force, countering the use of force against China in the Asia Pacific.
Excellent. 3 quick points in closing. First, thanks to Edward and Helen Hintz for sponsoring our book series. Second, free copies of the book are sitting on the table over there in order to reward folks who showed up in person this morning. And third, won't you join me in thanking this outstanding panel?